Interviewers, what's your best? Things were going well until story. I asked the applicant about their strengths and they spoke about how result-focused they were. It was going well so far. And then they started sharing examples of unethical things they did to get the job done, bribing customers, sharing misleading information, etc. Clearly, that was the end of that interview. I mean, it is amazing how stupid people can be at job interviews. He basically told me that there was potential that he would damage the business. You don't describe the unethical things you did. You say, I was able to develop new efficiencies. I found creative solutions or effectively solved problems. But this was straight up unabashedly wrong. I did share feedback after the interview, so I hope they got it then. They probably thought it was normal since nobody had called them out on it before. Story 2. When I was on the path to becoming an assistant to the manager, I had the opportunity to sit in on an interview. My boss reviewed the guy's resume and began the usual line of questioning. At one point, my boss asked why the interviewee had left his previous job. The interviewee initially claimed to have quit, but my boss's further questioning prompted the interviewee to slip up and admit that he had been asked to leave. Realizing he had been caught in a lie, the interviewee got up and left. After he was gone, my boss turned to me and remarked, I saw the felony in alternative school and really wanted to give him a chance. He was doing fine until I caught him lying. Story 3. I had an applicant tell me during the interview that her mother was outside and asked if she could bring her mother in to chat some more. The applicant was interviewing for her first employment as a full medical doctor. I've had one experience with a mother accompanying her daughter just until the room of the interview, and then this other experience I described. However, I know from a few colleagues that they were accompanied by their parents, at least to the place of the first interview as a doctor, with the parents not entering the building but just going to a cafe or something until the interview was over. This is surprising for me as well, but within limits. To provide some context, these are applicants for something that you would call residency in the US. After medical school and a one-year internship, you apply for placement as a resident. However, in Germany, you are not placed for residency. You apply at a hospital, and the hospital can decide if they accept you individually. These are people in their mid-20s who managed to go through medical school and an internship and should be able to cope on their own. Story 4. The department is a very male-dominated one, and I'm the only woman. I'm also the second stage of any interview to join us. It goes, the team leader talks to them, then I do, and then the grand boss does. The dude passed the sections of the interview conducted by men with flying colors. He spent the entire section led by me staring at my chest. I was wearing a friggin' turtleneck. He was newly graduated, so we gave him some feedback about appropriate interview conduct and hired a different candidate. Story 5. This isn't my story, but I know of someone who was part of a committee hiring a new professor. At the final stage, they had two candidates they all liked, so they took them both to dinner individually, pretty standard in academia. The first guy did really well, but after the meal, he picked up his plate and just started licking it clean. The committee was pretty weirded out and grossed out. The second guy also performed well, but he eventually asked, so what's the university's policy on dating students? The committee was like, I guess we're going with a plate licker. He will forever be immortalized as Dr. Plate Licker. Story 6. He complained about how there are too many poofters at his current job in retail. I asked him to repeat himself and he laughed and said, well, you know what they're like. You should have seen the look on his face when I told him I was gay and didn't think he would be a good fit for the company. He didn't even apologize. He just said he didn't mean it like that. I then just asked him to leave and he said that was discrimination but left quite quickly. I wish I'd have asked how he meant it though. It's been 10 years, but it's so depressing to think people think exposing their prejudice at an interview will help them. Story 7. It was going well until she suddenly said, I don't know why people think interviews are so hard. Like, all you have to do is be normal for 10 minutes. Just don't talk about your or whatever other you have. This was an interview for a residency position as a doctor. I'm not sure where she ended up, but not with us. I know it was a horrendous attempt at a joke on her part, but the point is that it was a very poorly timed joke, and right after she said she didn't understand why people are bad at interviews. It was bizarre, and it was a red flag about her ability to use common sense. Most aspects of being a doctor can be taught, and even people struggling with the knowledge aspect of it can usually be coached to success once they've gone that far. It's much harder to help those people who are bad at split-second decisions, which comes up frequently when you're caring for people who have just had a cardiac arrest or some other medical emergency. We sometimes use these red flags to weed out those people we fear might not do well with split-second decision-making. It could be a totally invalid metric, and maybe in this case, her poor judgment about an interview-appropriate joke would not have meant anything about her ability to care for critically ill patients. However, we get 4,000-plus highly qualified applicants to fill about 140 residency positions, so even these little issues are enough to make us move on to the next applicant. Story 8. I'm a young female software engineer, and I was interviewing this old-school 90s movie-type programmer guy who knew COBOL really well. I usually ask a tough algorithm problem, and I didn't expect him to do well, but I was preparing to make the argument that he has so much real-world experience and could add some diversity to our collective skill sets and culture, so we should consider hiring him anyway. I start with an easy version of the problem, and it's fine. It doesn't do great, but I expected that. Then I started explaining the harder version of the problem, but before I could finish, he said the problems were exactly the same. I'm taken aback, but I start to try to explain how the problem is different. And then he just starts yelling at me why he thinks the problem is the same. I sat down from the whiteboard and processed what just happened in silence for a few minutes. If I felt like I had the authority to end it there, I would have, but I didn't, so I attempted to continue. I work up the courage to start speaking again to try to help him, and as soon as the first sound comes out of my mouth, he immediately starts aggressively talking over to me about why he thinks the problem is the same and asks in a very patronizing tone if I understand what he's saying. My boss gave me the authority to just end interviews in the future if they're being an a-hole. Story 9. Not my story, but one from a friend. She was doing first-round interviews and screening for a role when a dude from a dating app who pumped, dumped, and ghosted just a few weeks earlier walked through from reception. It turns out he was using a fake name on his profile. She described it as an Abe Simpson moment where he walked through the door, had a sudden realization, and did a 180 straight out of the door without saying a single word. Even during an interview, this person got ghosted. Story 10. I asked a warm-up question to an applicant and they went about it for 20 minutes without stopping or letting me interject to ask any of the main questions. At one point I interrupted them and said something along the lines of, "That's great, let's move on to another topic," just to be told that they were not done, hadn't gotten to the point yet, and then proceeded to keep talking about the same thing for the remainder of the interview without me ever getting to ask any relevant question. Story 11. I didn't interview job applicants, but for one job they interviewed 2 of us at the same time for the same position, which was a worker at a gas station. They asked questions, and for one I would answer first, then he'd answer the next one first, and so on. It was my first job interview ever, as I just finished high school and the guy I was up against was more qualified in every way. So one question was, what would you do if you found out that our station manager was stealing stuff from the station or selling it to put money in his pocket? I said I would report him to the supervisor. This company has a chain of stations in every country, and for every region, there is someone who supervises the specific region. As we workers answer to the gas station manager, he has to answer to his region supervisor. They explained this all when they introduced us and told us about the company. The other guy's answer to this question was, I would blackmail the manager, saying that if he didn't include me in it, I would report him. I'll finish with the fact that I was the one who got the job. Story 12. Personal favorite. Me. Can you tell me about a time you were faced with an irate or difficult customer? The applicant told a story about working in airport security. They encountered a traveler from the Middle East. There was a language barrier and a misunderstanding. They tased the individual. Even the way they told the story couldn't make it sound like they were the ones in the right. On top of that, they used racist language, including the N-word. Yeah, no, thank you for your time. Story 13. My first professional job was as an HR manager at a small factory. I was interviewing an applicant for a job in our quality control unit. During the interview, his cell rings and he stops the interview and takes the call. He ends the call and tells me he just got another job offer and accepted the position. He proceeded to tell me his buddy was in the lobby and would be perfect for the job he was interviewing for with us. He wanted to go get him to take his spot at the interview. I could not believe what I had just witnessed. I declined to interview his buddy as he had not applied for the job. Some people are unreal. Funny how he thought he can transfer his interview over to someone else. Maybe that was the plan all along. Man, these stories are crazy. If you want to watch more videos like these, you just have to hit the like button and subscribe to my channel. Story 14. Panel. So you put Industry 4.0 in your CV so you have some knowledge about it. Interviewee. Yes, I do. Panel. How do you think it could be applied here? Interviewee. Panel. Where or how do you think it could be applied? Interviewee. Starts patting off some stuff about using CAD as if it were some amazing new thing. If you're going to put BS in your CV, at least make sure you know something about the topic, like what it is for a start. Story 15. About 20 years ago, I was working at a vocational school. New instructors were required to give a sample lecture as a part of the interview process, and the other instructors would be the audience. We would let them talk for a bit, then start interrupting with questions, easy ones at first, then getting harder until we decided they'd had enough. Usually they were judged not by their answers, but by how they handled the question. One day we had a guy who chose to lecture in computer hardware. He started okay, until the questions started. When my buddy reached into a box, pulled out a hard disk and said, "What's this?" The dude couldn't answer. The interview ended soon after. Story 16. It happened about a year ago when I was trying to grow a telemarketing team for a tech startup. I interview most people around my age, maybe a couple of years older, but then I interviewed a man who was over double my age. The whole interview was him trying to ask me questions about my role, my experience, and my age. I understand it was probably a shock to him to be interviewed by someone so young, but it was even more off-putting to me. It didn't really fit the vision of our team, but we did have another position we'd like to put him in, but that position was also filled. Story 17. I had a head cold and scheduled about 6 interviews throughout the day. The first 5 interviews went great, but my medication was wearing off, and 5 interviews is a lot in one day. I'm sitting outside the building for my last interview, talking to myself. It's the last one. You got this. I walk into the building and it's nice and cool. Perfect. The receptionist brings me to a small, dark room to have me fill out some paperwork and states that the interview will begin shortly. Okay, no problem. Cold air. I can breathe and I'm not stuffy. After about 5 minutes, the receptionist comes back into the dark room and says, "Follow me. They're ready for you." I feel super uneasy. The interview isn't in there. Nope, she brings me to this super bright, hot room with 6 interviewers ready for me. I'm doing well for about 2 minutes, until one of the interviewers says a joke to lighten the mood. I chuckled and a big snot bubble inflates and then pops all over my face. I pause for a moment like it didn't happen and continue to speak about my qualifications, and to make matters worse, one of them asks me if I would like a tissue. I finished the interview super awkwardly and never got a call back. And to top it off, my family called me Bubbles for about a year. That's terrible, Bubbles. Story 18. I was doing a basic boilerplate interview for an entry-level position, and everything was going well until my last question. I try to keep the last question kind of fun, but I also try to get an idea of how they view money since their job involves handling thousands of dollars a day in cash. So I asked them, if you had $1 million right now, what would you do with it? The normal, boring answer is to invest most of it and spend a little on stuff. This person's answer wasn't that. I'd put about half away for retirement, and the other half I'd invest into buying as many pills as I can so I could resell them. I have plenty of contacts, and the return on investment is pretty good if you buy bulk. Needless to say, that's a bit of a red flag. This is because people try to steal the daily deposit, buy and resell that night, and then complete the deposit in the morning. It happens much more than you'd think. Story 19. I did some interviews for the help desk I worked at many years ago. There was some light technical questions followed by troubleshooting scenarios where you would just walk us through how you solve a problem. One of the technical questions was, give an example of a browser plugin. The candidate proceeded to explain that a browser plugin is something you plug into your computer to either sit in the monitor, a webcam, or help you with your browsing, a mouse and keyboard. They also missed all the other questions we asked. On the plus side, they were very confident in the answers they gave us. Story 20. Somewhat related, but I used to work at this Japanese restaurant, and one day my boss had me pick up a potential new cook from the bus station. When I pulled up there, I saw him finishing a tall boy of Bud Light. I was thinking, oh man, this might not be good. He got in the car and seemed okay, so I offered him some gum, which he accepted and thanked me for. When we got to the restaurant, I didn't see much of him because I was out in the front, but man did I hear a lot. While the owner, Carol, and the other cooks were training him on what to do, he kept messing up and knocking things over. Carol was a really intense person. Crazy, most would say, and liked to berate people at first, but I have never seen her as mad as when this guy accidentally lit a rag on fire. That was it, she screamed. You're fired! Get out! She had me drive him back to the bus station, which was one of the most awkward car rides I've ever had. Story 21. In-person interviews for a copywriting position at a tech company went great until they asked me how much money I wanted. I have never been in a position to negotiate before and was still fairly new to the industry. I had no idea what my market value was. They wouldn't give me a ballpark. I tried to play it off and say that I was more interested in the opportunity than the money, but they insisted that they needed a figure to work with and that they wanted to pay me fairly. I said some number that was, in retrospect, way too low, and that what the look on their faces just said it all. I could tell they weren't going to call me back after that. It would be like a software engineer sitting down and telling you that $13 an hour sounds about right. You'd think something was seriously wrong with him or his work. Story 22. Things were going well until I met the manager team. So I had one of those all-day interviews with an engineer firm that needed someone with my skill set. They mostly needed someone to do assembly code but also automate testing on their factory floor. At the time, I was a contractor doing those two things. Perfect fit, right? A good friend recommended me for the job. I flew through the initial steps of the interview process and got called in to meet everyone. Well, the morning was all technical. It went great. My friend was there and his friends were there. We met and talked shop all morning. They were all EE guys who hated code. I was a coder who liked to design EE stuff from time to time. Perfect fit. Then I'm supposed to go to lunch with management. The first thing they ask is, where do I want to eat? Of course, I suggest anywhere they'd like first, and they insist, so I pick a Chinese place I like. They start making racist comments and basically busting the place for being cheap and dirty. Great. On the way, they start grilling me about the contracting firm I'm working with. I kept trying to avoid the mistake of talking crap about my current employer, but they just kept laughing about how terrible they thought the outfit was. I just kept saying, well, I don't really deal directly with anyone, but yeah, obviously I'm looking for another job. They apparently had some real beef with the CEO who I'd never met. Awesome. I remember something about hockey before I tuned out completely. They were complaining that the sissies in design and engineering never joined in their games and asked if I'd break that trend. I just answered honestly that I've never played hockey, but I'd give it a shot. They groaned, obviously not happy with that answer. It went on for hours, but by then I was just nodding my head and waiting for it to end. I wouldn't want to work in that kind of environment too. Story 23. This soon-to-be college graduate had passed 2 phone screens and was in the office going through our panel interviews for a software position. One of my engineers was scheduled to interview him next came to my office. The engineer had decided to take a deep dive through the candidate's GitHub repos, a software engineer's public portfolio for non-techies, as the basis for questions. The candidate was a person of color, but some of his projects were littered with incredibly derogatory and inflammatory language. Like multiple variables, there were variations of the hard R N-word as well as LGBT slurs. I stopped the interview right there, walked him out, and sincerely encouraged him to clean up his public repos before applying to any other companies. It sucked too because we all liked him and he was technically capable. It seemed like it was just a dumb college kid mistake on personal projects he thought no one would ever look at. However, we can't risk anything like that happening in any of our codes, and you never know what underlying issues could have caused those inclusions that the candidates need help with. Hopefully, it was a wake-up call for him. Story 24. I was hiring for a writer position in legal marketing. Looking at law students, they usually jump at the opportunity because it's remote, pays decently well for a student, and can be done in their own schedule. One candidate had some pretty decent experience in the field we're looking at. Not a bad personality, it seemed. I took a funny question in stride, then when asked about writing experience stated, "I'm not really a strong writer, I don't really like it." For a writer position, doesn't like writing, isn't good at writing. Story 25. A guy interviewed for a job he was underqualified for. I was looking for a guy with an electronics degree to repair electrical-based machines. He worked for Apple, repairing phones and iPads. He had no formal electronics or mechanical training and was a relatively young guy. He explained why he wanted to move to another job, what he hoped to achieve, and where he wanted to go. These were all things I wanted to hear, and he was certainly the standout candidate. I really thought he was in for a shot, but I thought it would take a year or two to train him up to the level where he would be an asset for us. The next question was, what kind of money would he be looking for? He asked for far more than what we had even advertised for. I explained this to him, and he said he wouldn't be willing to take a pay cut, even though in his own words he had reached his salary cap with his current employer. Under normal circumstances, I would call someone back in for another interview, but in this case, I knew this guy completely overvalued himself and was very short-sighted in his career. I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you made it this far, I'm sure you'll also enjoy hiring managers. What is wrong with this person moment? Story 5 is awkward. See you on that video.